Welcome to the Land to Lots podcast, powered by Launch Development Finance Advisors. And now your host, Carter Froelich.
Welcome, everyone. This is Carter Froelich, and happy to have you listening today on another episode of Land to Lots. Today, I'm really excited to have Scott Emery of Qualifyiing on the show. Scott has extensive experience in land development and construction management. And for those of you who may have worked with Qualifyiing in Southern California and other places around the state, you know that Qualifyiing is a firm that specializes in entitlement, land development, and construction management. Scott, welcome to the show. Glad you could join us today.
Thanks a lot, Carter. I appreciate the invitation and look forward to this conversation for sure.
And Scott, I'm really glad you're here, and I've been waiting for this for a long time. And the question that I want to discuss today relates to when our clients are financing infrastructure through some sort of special taxing district. So in California, Community Facilities District, Texas, it can be MUDs, and Colorado Metro Districts, all of these different financing vehicles where we're using public monies to construct or acquire public infrastructure. Our clients oftentimes get hung up on how they can get reimbursed for grading and how they can preserve the right to be reimbursed through these districts through the special district. And I know that you've got over 22 years of project management experience, and your background is in grading. And I thought if anybody knows how to answer this question, it's you. So before we get into having you answer that question, why don't you give us a little background of yourself and your company and what makes you uniquely qualified to talk about this specific issue, which can mean hundreds of thousands of dollars to our listeners.
Well, thank you. Hopefully I'm uniquely qualified. You know, it's hard. Things change all the time in California, especially. But yeah, I had 22 years of land development experience. I worked for Suki Construction, which is a heavy civil residential grading contractor here in Southern California. I was there for 18 years as a estimator, project manager, and we oversaw a lot of large master plan communities. We did everything from estimating, bidding it out, to value engineering, scheduling, costs of costing the projects. So 22 years of that, you kind of get the idea of what works and what doesn't. And also with the CFD portion of it, you have to figure out how to get reimbursed and what the best way of approaching that so that the agency that you're dealing with understands how you did it and how you came up with the quantities, how you came up with the costs, and what is included and what isn't.
Yeah, great. And to kind of set the stage, many times we'll have a client come to us, and here again, recovering CPA. So I'm the least, I'm the last one they should be talking about is in relation to grading and some of these issues. But our clients typically come to us and go, hey, we're mass grading the site. And as part of that, we're going to be cutting in the arterial and collector roadways, which are eligible for financing through the district. How do I go about preserving my right and quantifying my right in terms of dollars to be reimbursed through the district? And let's speak, as it relates primarily to California and issues of prevailing wage. And maybe during your explanation, Scott, you may want to talk a little bit about prevailing wage and what that can do and why developers, if they can avoid it, are trying to stay away from paying prevailing wage. So I know there's that's kind of a loaded question, but if you want to just unpack that and if we miss anything, I'll bring it back to the specific questions.
Sure. So starting out, when you're bidding the project, You're going to first have to publicly advertise it to everybody so that you can get qualified bids from all the contractors. You need to have a minimum of 3 qualified contractors to turn in proposals for the work. The district most of the time will take the qualified low bidder. Unit prices in the low bidder's proposal will be the basis of the reimbursement dollars for the project that makes up the CFD.
Mm-hmm.
And we will get into a little bit more detail how you quantify the unit prices and what the quantities are to set what that CFD to essentially calculate the quantities for the CFD reimbursable items.
And this doesn't necessarily apply to every state, but the Davis-Bacon or payment of prevailing wage, in your experience, and here again, I'm not going to hold you to the specifics, but what does that typically do if we're having to pay prevailing wage to a project in relation to grading? Whereas if we weren't looking for reimbursement, we wouldn't have to necessarily pay prevailing wage.
Sure. Let's just start with what is the Davis-Bacon and why do you have to have prevailing wage? They need to be bid with prevailing wage because it's a public financing, and everyone needs to be using the same set standard wage so we can compare the proposals apples to apples, right? So that's the first thing. But it goes into a little bit more detail. Depends on what you believe in the government's role in this. But another reason is, which can be argued either way, is that paying a higher wage equals higher quality skilled labor. You can believe that or not, but one thing I will say is if you're going to have a prevailing wage or a union scale with union contractors, you have a larger, in most cases, you have a larger labor pool to pull from, right? People are saying people work harder and it takes more pride in what they do because of them being paid more. Now, I don't necessarily believe in that, but that's in essence why they came up with this rule, right?
Yeah.
The government officials, their official stance in it is that there is no impact on the overall costs, but obviously other economists say the opposite. What I do know is what it does to your grading costs. You end up paying, in some areas, 30 to 40% higher premium on labor because you're hiring prevailing wage and union wages. There are some other factors that close the gap, obviously, but that goes back into having a larger labor pool and you be able to pick more qualified people to run those operations in theory. So that's why they did it. That's my understanding.
Ouch. Yeah. And we'll leave it up to the audience to determine if they agree with the government stance on that. But we'll just skip over that. Now, let's say, Scott, if we're doing a mass grade on a site, right, and I want to avoid paying the 30 or 40% premium on labor for the mass grade, and I just want to preserve my right to get reimbursed for the grading of the right. Let's just keep it in this example, the grading of the collector and arterial streets, so that I can preserve my right to be reimbursed. Can you split the contract so it's prevailing wage on the grading of the collectors and arterials, and then non-prevailing wage on the remainder of the clear and grub and mass grade of the site? Or does it have to be lumped together as one prevailing wage contract?
That's a great question. You can break it up, and you should break it up, obviously, to get the best price that you can. What you'll end up doing is bidding out separate line items with separate quantities. So a lot of being paid reimbursable for CFD or whatever your agency is that you're dealing with, it's really important to set it up early and to think it through in the early process of bidding it out. So you don't want to bid out the entire project with non-union wages or whatever you're using, but you also don't want to bid out the entire project with union wages if you don't have to. What you do need to do is break up those line items and have a definitive line on where that is, and it's usually right away to right away. And when I say right away to right away, what I mean is from the edge of right away, you'll have maybe a cut slope coming off of that, and to get into the nuances of it a little bit, a cut is from natural ground down to design, right? If your design is lower than your natural ground, and whatever your design slope factor is from right away up to natural ground, say it's a 2-to-1 ratio slope, that also is included. So that prism of material is all able to be quantified as reimbursable costs. And the same is true for if you're in a fill area, which would be defined as design higher than your natural ground. And normally, especially in California, you're going to have removals or remedial grading that you need to do to get a competent bottom so that you can start placing that fill in there. Now, what that'll be is from right away, you will have a 1-to-1 slope down to your removal bottom. Say it's a 10-foot removal. And then from that point, the other direction, a 1-to-1 up back to natural, so that you can get your compacted fill inside that sphere of influence of your fills. That will be included in it. And then obviously everything inside of the right of way, which would be your street improvements, your utilities, all of those things. So that is pretty much the prism that you'll have that you can get reimbursed for. Everything that you do inside of that needs to be prevailing wage.
Yep.
And so when you quantify those before you go out to bid, you make sure that everybody buys in, the agency buys in on how you're coming up with your prism in the cross sections or however you want to do it, to show them that these are the quantities that you're going to get reimbursed for. And those, when you go out to bid, need to be separate because that has a different pay scale.
Yeah.
For your union wage or your prevailing wage, I should say.
Yeah. And so you don't want to go out and not break it apart, get your bids, and then have to come back and rebid the whole thing again, because it's going to take you time and money to go back up and rebid everything, just if you wanted to pick up, in this instance, your right-of-way costs. So the best thing is to, engage with somebody that's knowledgeable, such as yourself, to help them with those bid packages as it relates to this. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
Absolutely. You need to pick your entire team. And with that prevailing wage, you need to have somebody that can track that prevailing wage and make sure that those contractors are actually paying the scales, the prevailing wage scales that they're supposed to, and how many hours they have for that particular task inside of that right of way. If they don't, now the paperwork trail gets all jumbled up, and now you're not getting reimbursed. Your package is incomplete and it's not in non-compliance, and now you don't get reimbursed the dollars that you should be, because you're behind the 8 ball and you didn't pick the right team to begin with to be able to track that. And a lot of the times it's very difficult for a contractor, because some are sophisticated, some are not. They're paying their people off of a foreman's report on a daily basis out in the field. They put hours in the wrong spot. Now that doesn't match with what you're submitting for your reimbursables in your prevailing wage. So those have to match. You have to have somebody that audits all of that, and that's part of your team, and it's very important. I know you guys do that. So those two things is really, making sure you're planning ahead and making sure that you have the right team is paramount, because they're very picky about what gets approved and what doesn't. And if you don't have the perfect paper trail, they'll just kick it all back, and then you got to go back to the drawing board. And if you're not doing it in a weekly basis, you got to go back sometimes 2 years later and try to find out what happened. And most of the people can't.
Yeah, and trying to get prevailing wage reports from the contractors 2 years after the fact is really difficult. And hallelujah on that. Just having put together a lot of these packages for reimbursement, I'll tell you, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. To have the right team on board day one, everybody knows what they're doing and why they're doing it. And then to have the contractors on board with, what type of documentation needs to be provided to the developer, when it needs to be provided, and then to build those reimbursement packages as you're developing, at least once a month or at a minimum once a quarter, so you still have while everything is fresh in everybody's memory.
Yeah, and I'll just say one more thing to that is it's really important to make sure that you are talking to the agency that's going to reimburse you to see how they want to see it, and how you present it to them, and it's easily digestible. And if you have change orders, how do you want those change orders to go in, and how are you going to handle those change orders if those change orders are maybe done by a contractor that wasn't the low bid and wasn't included in that package to begin with in your original proposal that you got accepted. So you really have to be in communication all the time with the agency that you're dealing with, because if you're assuming you're going to get reimbursed with something and they don't agree with you, guess what? You're not getting paid.
To that end, what we do is obviously make sure that everything is very detailed in the acquisition and reimbursement agreement, but then also literally is to go into the agency and talk with those that are in the field and really doing or inspecting and or approving the reimbursement requests, is to make sure that we have a clear understanding with them. We give them a follow-up memo after the meeting saying, this is our understanding, this is what we heard, this is what you're looking for, this is what we're going to be providing. Can you acknowledge receipt of this and that our understandings are in agreement with one another? And then we have that for the files. Should there be a change of the guard at the agency, we can go back and say, on this date, we had a meeting and this was the understanding, and this is how we've been moving this process forward. And typically that works well, for us and what we're doing. Have you had kind of the same experience, Scott?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And what are some of the pitfalls, if any, you've seen as it relates to trying to carve out and save the costs of your grading in this case from contracts which oftentimes aren't bid prevailing wage?
Yeah, what I see is obviously what we just touched on. Plenty of documentation. The incomplete packages is a big one, and like I said, it takes a long time to get some of this work done. Several years in some cases, and to have to go back to the beginning is brutal.
Yeah.
The other one is having the backup for all your takeoffs associated with how you're getting reimbursed, and that's CAD files, AutoCAD files, your topo shots of your removals, your spreadsheets. All the information has to be in a tidy package to prove what you did is exactly what you did. So a lot of as-built and that kind of documentation is really a big deal, and a lot of people don't have that or don't submit that, and that just leads to them turning it back around and throwing it back in your lap, and then you got to figure out what they're looking for. And if you know ahead of time what they're looking for, and you have an experienced team that has done this several times, you know exactly what that looks like.
Yeah. And the as a developer is listening to this and they're going, this makes a lot of sense. I want to preserve all my eligible costs so that I can get reimbursed sooner rather than later for some of these dollars I'm expending. What are the questions that they should be asking before they pull the trigger and start to move forward with this? with, and let's just continue with our example, their mass grade and preservation of their grading of street right-of-ways.
Well, it's kind of what we've already been talking about. It's the picking your team before the project starts is huge, obviously, and we kind of touched on why that is, and how do you structure the process, i.e., who's tracking the prevailing wage, and we obviously touched on that as well, and how do we structure the change orders and get reimbursed if necessary. So those are the three questions that I think are the most important, that a lot of builders don't ask, and rightfully so. They if they haven't been through the process, it's stuff that you wouldn't know, and it's the stuff that bites you.
Yeah.
And that's why picking the right people are so important.
Yeah, you like to have your team having participated in a lot of rodeos. Been there, done that. Okay.
Hopefully one of the buckles too.
Yeah, yeah, they won the buckles. And now let me turn that around, since we're talking about that. You've been involved and in the trenches for a lot of years, and managing projects, doing land development, grading. And this doesn't necessarily relate to prevailing wage or preserving costs for reimbursement through a special district. But what have been your learning experiences that you'd like to share with the audience?
The biggest one that I tell everybody that asks, or the young people that I work with, is treat everybody fairly. I know obviously it's obvious to a lot of us, but realistically, treating everybody fairly and helping everybody that you can along the way, even if it doesn't benefit you, doing the right thing. Because I'll give you a perfect example. When I was working for Stuka Construction, we had a job and it was doing quite well, but a subcontractor came to me and said, "Hey, we missed a bunch of fence out here." And it was not the end of the world, but it was tens of thousands of dollars that they didn't have in their bid. And I could have stuck it to them and said, "Hey, I got a contract here and you got to perform." But I helped them out. And on the next phase of that job, I missed something. And I said, "Hey, I missed this." And he didn't hesitate. And he said, "Look, I got you." And look, we all have to have a job, unfortunately, right? But it's great to have relationships with everybody, because everybody has to have a job. You might as well enjoy working with the people that you're working with. And I think that goes a long way. That's what in the 22 years I've been doing this, I think, and that relates to every business outside of construction. It's across the board. Enjoy what you're doing and treat people fairly. And even if it doesn't come back to help you in the future, that's what's important.
Yeah, what comes around goes around, and you've got a great reputation, and you've got so many high profile clients, and there's a reason for that, and I think you just hit on it, Scott. So you've given me a lot of, and our listeners a lot to think about as it comes to grading, construction management. Is there any question that I should have asked you but I didn't? Anything else you'd like to add that the audience should know?
You know what, Carter, I think you did a great job of asking the right questions, and we covered enough to make people just dangerous enough. So I think you nailed it, and I think we did a decent job there.
Great. Well, Scott, thanks for taking the time today to be on the podcast. And to all of our listeners, all of Scott Emery's contact information will be included in our show notes. Scott, if anybody wanted to fire off an email to you, how do they get a hold of you?
It would be semery@qtative.com. That's QTATIVE.com.
Great.
You could reach me on my phone is 949-422-7405.
And don't be bashful. Give Scott a call. He'd love to hear from you. And Scott, with that, I'd just like to say thanks again. And for all of our listeners, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Land to Lots. Thank you.
You have been listening to the Land to Lots podcast with Carter Froelich. Tune in next week for the next episode.